This is the third tutorial video on the agricultural risk management tool of crop rotations, also referred to as RotationARM. The tutorial will focus on comparing the performance of alternative cropping strategies. This tutorial starts off from the pre-filled RotationARM tool and exercise workbook as completed in the first two RotationARM videos. This section of the RotationARM tool guides you to define an alternative cropping strategy that will be compared to the earlier specified reference cropping strategy. Section A provides you some guidance questions that can help you to define promising options of an alternative cropping strategy. Given our earlier finding that the reference cropping strategy only reached a low cropping intensity and a medium level of gross margin, we will explore specifically if a higher cropping intensity would reach a higher gross margin. We again select sorghum, wheat and chickpea as the crops that must be part of our target rotations. From the resulting list of 12 rotations, we choose for our exercise rotation number 80. Rotation 80 is rather similar to the earlier selected rotation number 56, but it has further two crops scheduled. Its overall cropping intensity is 1.75 crops per year as opposed to 1.25 crops per year for the earlier chosen reference rotation number 56. Rotation 80 has more winter crops scheduled, and we again note down our selection in the exercise workbook. We will then scroll down to the next subsection in the tool where we specify the sowing rule of the alternative cropping strategy. To ensure that a higher cropping intensity is achieved, we will select a less conservative sowing rule than in our reference rotation. Now we will specify that the plant available soil water needs to exceed only 40% of its full capacity instead of the earlier 75%. Again, we will keep track of our parameters chosen by documenting them in the exercise workbook. As earlier, we keep the nitrogen application level as medium and note this down in the booklet as well. Next, we click on Compare Results to navigate to the following screen in the tool. This section presents us with a comparison of the reference and alternative cropping strategy. Section A on top, that is located here, provides us with an overall overview of the parameters that we specified. We see that both cropping strategies differ in terms of the crop rotation schedule, as well as the sowing rule. Section B then provides us with the annual performance of both cropping strategies when averaging over all 60 years of data. We see that our alternative cropping strategy indeed led to a much higher cropping intensity of about 1.1 crops, as opposed to the earlier 0.7 crops per year achieved by the reference system. Both systems face nearly no crop failure. However, as intended, the higher cropping intensity of the alternative cropping strategy indeed translated to a substantially higher gross margin. The alternative cropping strategy achieves a gross margin of about 1,400 Australian dollars per hectare, whereby the reference cropping strategy only achieved about $1,000 per hectare. At the same time, the alternative cropping strategy is also more risky. On average, it faces the risk of gross margin falling $25 below the minimum annual threshold gross margin of $500 per hectare. Instead, the reference crop rotation falls never below this minimum threshold. As another aspect of the higher cropping intensity, the alternative cropping system further achieves a higher crop water uptake. We again will note down the results into the exercise workbook. This is done on page 31 in the second column. However, which performance dimension is really most important to you will strongly depend on your own farm circumstances and your personal preferences. You can now see that the overall results for the alternative cropping strategy have been noted down in the second column on the right-hand side under option 1. This will allow later on an easier comparison between the two cropping strategies, even after we close down the tool. When we scroll down a little bit further in the tool, we see a time series graph, and it shows that the alternative cropping system generally provides higher gross margins than the blue indicated reference cropping system. If we zoom in a little bit further on any subsection of our liking, we will see that the higher gross margin levels from the alternative cropping system predominantly stems from a better performance in the winter season. If we scroll further down below to section C, we see more detailed results for individual crops. This allows us to identify one relevant aspect of the comparison between our reference and alternative cropping strategy. We see that the median yields under the reference cropping strategy are actually higher than for the alternative cropping system. However, given the fact that the alternative cropping system includes much less follows and cultivates much more often, we achieve an overall higher level of gross margin with the alternative cropping strategy. If we again compare the performance on the left-hand side for all seasons and on the right-hand side for selected seasons, we see that both the reference cropping strategy and the alternative cropping strategy in this case suffer very, very similarly from being exposed to dry conditions. If in case we would have chosen an alternative cropping strategy that uses entirely different crops than the reference strategy, it could have been that the drought sensitivity would have been very different for the two cropping strategies. At the very bottom, we see again the time series graphs for the individual crops on the left-hand side for the reference cropping strategy and on the right-hand side for the alternative cropping strategy. This ends the basic tutorial on how to compare the performance of two cropping strategies. In our specific example, the alternative cropping strategy sustainably improved the gross margin while leading to very few disadvantages. Accordingly, the alternative cropping strategy is probably worth considering over the reference cropping strategy. However, here we have only compared two alternatives, and farmers commonly want to conduct more thorough and comprehensive reflections. For such further analysis, you can click on the Interpretation button on the bottom right-hand side of the page. On the subsequent page, the two gray buttons allow you to iteratively continue to simulate further options. In our case, we would choose the right button to explore further options to the current alternative cropping strategy. In that way, we may still evaluate further alternatives, like for example, other crop compositions. This ends our series of tutorial videos about the RotationARM tool.